This presentation is for Section 3, Victory for the North, pages 420 to 426. And as you can see from the title, Bringing the War to an End, this covers the final 2 years of the Civil War and what was happening in the country. This shows you some of the battles that are being fought in the West. If you look at the kind of middle of the map, Vicksburg is the one in particular that we're looking at because of its importance. Vicksburg is a city in Mississippi. It's kind of up on a hill looking down on the Mississippi River. So if Union forces tried to move any ships along the Mississippi, the cavalry in Vicksburg could shoot down upon them, and that's not a good thing, obviously. So Grant needed to take control of Vicksburg and take control of the Mississippi River. So what happened was he laid siege to the town, and what that means is he basically surrounded them and cut them off from anyone being able to get in or out. And that meant not just people, but any kind of supplies. And for 6 weeks, he surrounded and laid siege to Vicksburg until finally the people had to surrender because they were out of food and water and they just couldn't survive any longer. And that happened on July 4th, 1863. The people of Vicksburg had to surrender. They were very bitter about this, and literally for the next 80 years they refused to celebrate the 4th of July because to them that was the memory of the day they had to surrender to the North, and they were very upset about that. But for the North, they now had complete control of the Mississippi River, which was part of, if you remember, the Anaconda Plan. Now they control the river and they've cut the Confederacy in half. So very important victory for Union forces. Next we're looking at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is basically happening at the same time as Vicksburg. In Virginia, you can see there were a couple battles, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Those were huge victories for the Confederate Army. And because of this, Robert E. Lee felt that now was the time, the Confederacy's on a roll, now's the time to go into the North and invade the North and have a major battle there and presumably have a victory, and that will show the Northern people that the South is not willing to give up, and hopefully the Northern people would be so upset about this that they would put pressure on Washington to surrender and end the war. So that was kind of the game plan for the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee marches his Confederate forces towards Pennsylvania and the town of Gettysburg. And this battle happened over 3 days. You've watched the video about this, so it went into more detail about how all of that happened. But just remember, July 3rd, the final day, was the famous Pickett's Charge, and what that was Confederate troops basically marching across an open field trying to get through the Union line there, and it was a complete slaughter of the Confederate troops, a terrible loss for them. Lee took his remaining troops and got away and went back down into Virginia. So Gettysburg is a huge victory for the North, a huge loss for the South. And now the North has these two very important victories, first Vicksburg and then Gettysburg, all happening at the same time. So these are considered kind of the turning points of the war. And from this point forward, the North is just gaining more and more ground and having more victories, and everything kind of seems to be going in their direction. This shows you the numbers from Gettysburg. It was the largest battle in terms of soldiers and also in terms of losses within the war. It lasted 3 days, as we saw. Terrible numbers of casualties. The problem for the South was, if you remember, they had a smaller population. They couldn't afford to lose 28,000 men over a few days' battle because they didn't have the numbers to replace them. So as I said, a very hard loss for the South. Also happening now is President Lincoln is up for re-election, and he is arguing that the war must be won, the slaves must be freed, the Union must be preserved at all costs. Now is not the time to stop fighting. Again, we've just had these decisive victories at Vicksburg, at Gettysburg. The North is on a roll. We just can't stop now. We have to keep going, and we have to preserve the Union and bring the South back into the United States. His opponent in this election is George McClellan, who, ironically enough, used to work for Abraham Lincoln. At the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln had appointed McClellan in charge of all the northern forces, and he had been in charge of fighting the war in the early years. But he and Lincoln often butted heads about tactics and how things should be done, and they just didn't see eye to eye on much of anything. So Lincoln eventually fired McClellan, and now McClellan is running against him for the election. McClellan argued that we've had enough of the war. We should just stop, let the South secede, let them be their own country, and just everyone get back to their lives. And that was his platform as far as why people should vote for him. As you can see, these are the results of the election of 1864. Lincoln fairly easily won and beat McClellan, and he is going to remain president. Also at this time, Abraham Lincoln hires or appoints Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all the U.S. forces. Grant was the winner at Vicksburg. He had several decisive victories in the East and the West, and Lincoln felt that Grant was the best man for the job at this point. And Grant also believed in the idea of fighting total war, and total war means that you're taking the war not just to the armies, but also to the civilians. And civilians are usually supposed to be left alone. They're not supposed to be casualties of the war. You're not supposed to be involving them in anything. But total war means making life miserable basically for everyone, not just the armies, but for the civilians as well. Burning down their homes, taking their crops, destroying their property as well. Just making life miserable for everybody. And Grant, that's the style of war that he fought. Grant's kind of second in command was William Tecumseh Sherman, and he fought what's known as the March to the Sea. If you follow the blue lines there, you can see he started in Chattanooga in Tennessee and just basically marched his troops all the way to the coast, to the Atlantic Ocean and Savannah. And along the way, like Grant, he fought total war. He destroyed everything in his pathway. He burned down people's homes. The soldiers stole their property, ransacked their homes, took their food, plowed their fields, just destroyed literally everything in their pathway. And Sherman believed war is hell, and you have to just, make it as miserable as you can for your enemy so that they'll give in and they'll surrender. He burnt Savannah to the ground. If you've ever watched the movie Gone with the Wind, you'll see the kind of reenactment of the destruction of Savannah. And then he marched his troops north through South Carolina into North Carolina until finally at the end of the war he defeats all the Confederate forces in that particular area. This shows the final year of the war, and all the fighting is happening in Virginia for the most part, as you can see. And this is basically Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy against Ulysses S. Grant and the Union forces. Starting in the north up at Wilderness, Lee keeps retreating and Grant keeps following him, and you just follow the orange and then the blue, the orange and then the blue, and then you can see that Grant is just relentless. Lee keeps trying to get away. Grant keeps chasing after him, and they have these battles at these various places. But these are costly victories for Grant. Grant's winning all of them, but he's losing thousands and thousands of men at each of these battles. And people in the North are just getting horrified at the huge number of losses that the Union was suffering. But Grant, again, this is what total war is about. You can't ever let up. You have to keep pounding and pounding your enemy until they surrender. And he chased Lee all the way to Petersburg. And then once again, he laid siege to the city. Unlike Vicksburg, though, which only lasted 6 weeks, the siege of Petersburg lasted about 10 months, where the city was surrounded and cut off from everything, until eventually Lee was able to kind of escape with his remaining troops and kept retreating. Grant, as you can see, if you follow the arrows, keeps chasing after him until finally they meet up in a little town called Appomattox Courthouse, and Lee, on April 9th, 1865, Lee finally surrenders. This is the place where their meeting happened between Grant and Lee. That's a picture of them there. Lee in the, it's supposed to be gray, it maybe kind of looks like a lighter blue color, and then Grant in the darker navy color. They're meeting in the parlor of these people's homes, and there's a picture of the farmhouse there in Appomattox Courthouse where they're meeting. What's kind of ironic about this is the man who owns this farmhouse, he had originally lived in the city of Bull Run up in the northern part of Virginia, and that was the first major battle of the war was at Bull Run, and that happened right on his farmland, and he was so sick of war he didn't want to be a part of it, so he moved his family farther south to this little town of Appomattox Courthouse where he thought he'd get away from most of the fighting. And then ironically what happens is they use his house as their meeting place for the final surrender of the battle. So he was known to tell people that the war started in my farm fields and ended in my living room parlor. So this one man kind of ironically was there at both the beginning and the end. But that's the portrait of the surrender between Lee and Grant. This shows you numbers again, casualties. As you can see, the North had greater casualties, and that's simply because they had more people fighting in the war. They had more people to lose, which they did. So you can see from the wounded and the deaths and so on that the North, unfortunately, was greater than the South in those areas. This shows you Civil War deaths in comparison to all the other wars up to World War II. As you can see, twice as many people died in the Civil War as soldiers that died in World War II. And I'm going to ask you when I see you, why do you think that is? Why were the deaths so much greater in the Civil War than in any of the other wars? So think about that so you can give me an answer. Finally, war is over. After the surrender, you now have the difficult task of rebuilding and reunifying the country once again. And that's just one of the pictures of what the South looks like, totally destroyed and decimated. And now we need to kind of put our differences behind us and move forward as a nation.